Programming Throwdown, episode 130, Ethical Hacking with Ted Harrington. Take it away, Jason.
Hey, everybody. So this is a super exciting episode. I think, I remember, and I'm totally drawing a blank, but there was, I remember some movies from the 90s, about hacking and when I got into computing, when I was in high school and middle school, there weren't a lot of folks who were into it, at least in my neighborhood, in my area, and everyone thought that that was hacking. Like, oh, you know how to program. Does that mean you can just, plug into this ATM and take all the money? And sadly, I've never been able to do that. But it would be pretty awesome if you could just get money that easily. But I've always had a fascination with it. I think that it's an intersection of so many different disciplines, sociology, psychology, computing, networking, so many different areas. And we've been wanting to do this episode for a really long time. I'm so excited that we have Ted Harrington, who's number one best-selling author and a partner at ISE, who's going to explain all about hacking and ethical hacking and what that all means. So thank you so much for coming onto the show, Ted.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Cool. So let's maybe just start with a bio on you. So how did you get into kind of this industry and what was sort of the path that led you to ISE where you're at right now?
It's funny you mention hacking ATMs because there was this funny thing that happened in college. This is a little bit tangential, but it will color the picture a little bit. I went to school in Washington D.C. and it doesn't matter that it was DC. I went to college and there
All
was
right.
ATM on campus. And I remember there was this thing that happened one time where there was a bug in the software where whatever the denomination was that you typed in, the ATM actually spit out 4 times that. So like people were putting in, $100 that they want to take out and they were getting 400.
Wow.
And so, of course, once the word spread about this, like the whole student body went and like emptied this ATM. It happened in like an hour.
Yeah.
And I remember that time, it sort of struck me, but it was one of these seeds of a thought that stayed in the back of my mind. I didn't really do anything with it at the time, but wow, software really runs everything. And when the software bugs out, really bad things can happen. And it's kind of interesting to think that, that was however old I was in college, I don't know, 20 or something. And, fast forward to many years later, that is my profession now, is not specifically necessarily robbing ATMs, but
Yeah.
helping companies who are building things using software to make sure that stuff like that doesn't happen. And I first got into it about 10 years ago when I met a guy who has become my business partner now. And at the time, we were just talking about some of the things he was doing with his business. And I was talking about things I wanted to do with my life and some of my principles and philosophies. And it was like the perfect marriage. I'm driven to do difficult things that matter in the service of others. I want to get better every day. Like those are kind of some of my defining principles. And those are the principles that are required to succeed in security. And so once I sort of found that, it was like, this is what I got to do. And I've since dedicated, my entire life to it. And now I'm in the position that I get to lead some of the smartest group of ethical hackers ever, anywhere. And that's what we do all day, is help companies build better, more secure systems.
Wow, super cool. So I have a similar story. It's not my story, but I'll share it anyways. And Patrick, you also took this. We both took VxWorks training, probably at different times, definitely different times. But Patrick probably just breezed through it. I was having trouble. I hadn't done any embedded stuff, and so I was working my way through it. But I remember the instructor saying that he noticed the gas dispenser, at a gas station was running VxWorks, and he noticed it because it had a certain JTAG kind of connector, and he just connected in and got a VxWorks terminal, and he found that the price of gas was literally just called price of gas, and it was a global variable in the program. So he just changed it to zero, pumped his gas for free, and then went back and reported it to whatever multinational was running that gas station. But yeah, it does sound like the early days of computing was sort of this wild west, and then through a lot of work done by people like you, it's just the security's just become a lot tighter now, and there's a lot more on the line now than there used to be back then when things weren't as so tightly connected as they are now.
Yeah, I would actually maybe even challenge the assumption that things are tighter now, because this is going to sound contradictory. They are and they aren't. So what's really good that we see happening all over the place is that where the efforts of the security community, the security research community, the ethical hackers, like where those of us that are really driving and pushing for this type of improvement in security, where we focus our efforts, it is changing. Like things are getting better. Um, but the problem is that the world, I mean, we're talking about the entire planet, is so relentlessly adopting software to, replace previous processes or systems, sometimes that were often very done manually or by human action, are now being done by computers. And new ways of applying computational approaches are constantly being innovated. And that itself introduces two problems. One is change, any type of change fundamentally adjusts the security model. But two, the second part of the problem is that oftentimes people will think, oh, well, this is completely new. This is like the new age, state of the art, whatever, fill in the blank. We don't have to worry about those security challenges the same way anymore. It's like, actually, you have to worry about them more because it's now a different thing. So that mindset
Right.
really becomes quite a problem. So I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you fully, but I'm just modifying the way you stated it. Some things are getting tighter, but some things are actually getting worse. And actually, both are happening at the same time.
Ah, interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's a real arms race. It's an arms race between the ethical and the non-ethical hackers, and it's also an arms race between the ethical hackers and productivity. The developers who want to just get this beta version of this code out really quickly, and who cares if it has some security issue? We just need to get this result really quick. And so it seems like there's a sort of triangle there.
So there's a lot of truth in what you just said. The conflict actually is less that developers don't care about security. I think any developer listening to this right now would probably dispute that,
Hmm.
because they're being told, like, either they already care about it or they're being told by their boss or their any member of the leadership in the company, like, you have to care about this. The problem isn't whether they care or not. The problem is, how are they going to do that? Because building and breaking are two fundamentally different things. So here's a way to think about it. I'm a big believer in using metaphors to try to explain what can be sometimes really complicated ideas. This one I don't think is that complicated, but this idea that you think about building a skyscraper, right? There is a person, a type of general contractor who that's what they specialize in. They build high rises. If you went to that contractor and you said, okay, now we need you to be the demolition expert. Can you demo a skyscraper? They'd be like, maybe. Yeah, I mean, I guess I know where the weakness is. I could probably, yeah. Okay, let's do that. But would they know what they're doing relative to the person who spends every waking minute demoing buildings, right? It's like it's an
Right.
impossible ask to think that just because they're related, that someone can be the expert in both. And that's what businesses are asking of developers. They're like, you have to build it and you also have to be the expert in how to break it. And that's just unreasonable, and that's impractical. And when push comes to shove, and when the boss says to the developer, you have to build it. It has to be done by this period, by this time. It has to meet this quality standard. Oh, and it has to be secure. When push comes to shove, what's going to get axed? The security part, because it's
Right.
also not what the developer's area of expertise is. So that sucks for a developer, right? Because that's really bad for a developer because they're being pushed into this difficult box. I have so much empathy for that situation that they're in. Once we realize that is the business problem that it is, then we can start to figure out how do we address it.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah, I think yeah, to continue your analogy, I think there's a whole bunch of really interesting uh bits there on how people demo buildings, in real life, and how they make it so the building implodes. It doesn't like fall on another building and kill a bunch of people or something. And so people who build buildings wouldn't know anything about that. And yeah, and speaking from experience, I built a lot of software, and we had an issue. This is about a year ago, where we had a external facing website for a team. My team was working on an open source system that was published in the open source, really for brand awareness and advertising of our work and to contribute back to the research community. And we had an internal version. And to kind of cut the story short, one of the engineers accidentally allowed anybody to take over, to hijack our website. And there was a team internally that actually is just focused on hijacking company websites. And so I want to say within maybe even less than an hour, I mean, it must have been automated. Basically, they instantly hijacked our website, and then they set up a meeting on our calendar where we could talk about how we totally got owned. And they explained a whole bunch of stuff to us that us researchers had never known before. But yeah, I mean, that team totally saved our bacon, because we didn't. It would have been terrible if we had been hijacked by somebody else.
Totally. Yeah. Well, I'm glad they reached out to you. It sounds like they went through responsible disclosure. There's maybe some questionable parts of what exactly they did. But yeah, you're right. You want the good guy to find it, not the bad guy to find
Yeah, totally. So this is really interesting. So you're in DC and you're in college, right? And so you met this gentleman while you're in college. And the two of you, yeah, like, kind of, can you bridge the gap from that to go to ISC? Like, did you start ISC right then and there, or is there what's in the middle there?
No, there was actually a pretty significant gap there. And one of the things that I would highlight out of this is for anybody who's right now thinking about security as a career, but thinks, well, I don't know as much as all these other people, or I don't have enough, the ship has already sailed. I'm already down whatever this engineering path is that I'm down. Um, it's not too late. I didn't enter security until I would have probably been at that point. I should know this, but I would have been probably my late 20s. So, I'd had 10-ish years of a career already. And so I knew nothing by my late 20s. And then over the course of 10 years, I went on to figure out how to write a #1 best-selling book on the topic. And so if I can do it, other people can figure it out too. And the time in between, I was essentially, I wasn't even in tech. I was chasing my entrepreneurial dreams, which was, I was looking for some mentorship. So I worked at a company for a little while that I was able to work directly under the CEO of this one company. And then I became the CEO myself of a tech company that was focused around water. And then I met the guy who would become my business partner almost by chance. Like we knew a guy in common. I knew this guy from the NSA who went to the PhD program with my business partner, and this guy in common was like, "You guys are in such different worlds, but you should meet." And so we did. And so in a sense, it was being open to whatever opportunities might present themselves. Because on paper, like, we shouldn't even have met each other. We were just like in such different worlds. And we knew pretty much right away, because philosophically we were very aligned.
Hmm.
And in a way, all those years not in security at all have helped me be able to be a better communicator about security, because I came in to this profession so much later than most people. I mean, I'm surrounded by people who are like, "Oh yeah, I like ripped open a video game console when I was 5." And I'm like,
Yeah, right.
"Well, I didn't even know what the principles of security were until I was like 29." Like, there's a
Hmm.
huge difference between that. But because I was able to come from this other perspective that was like, explain that to me. I don't understand that. All of the assumptions that I should know anything, I was not troubled by them. And that's one of the things that I think holds a lot of people back. They're like, "Oh, I have a degree in computer science. I should probably know this thing. So I'm not going to ask a question that might make it seem like I don't know what I'm talking about." I'm like, hey guys, Ted here. Don't know what I'm talking about. Quick question.
Yep,
And
yep.
because of that, I was able to sort of like build this foundation of knowledge over a long period of time. And that was something I hope everyone listening to this can realize, like, no one knows anything about anything. So just ask questions. No one's going to judge you. Like, we all have imposter syndrome. We all think we're not smart enough. Just keep pushing and asking questions and you'll figure it out.
Yeah, that's really, really good advice. Yeah, definitely. I think, every job that I've ever had, I went through the imposter syndrome phase where basically I said, you know, I kind of um, I got lucky in this interview, or I interviewed at four places and I picked one job. That's because I got lucky that one time, and or I really oversold myself in the interview, and now I don't know what I'm doing. This is completely common. Everybody goes through imposter syndrome every single time. Um, and so I think that the thing that over time I've learned is to is it's kind of like I'm trying to remember what there's a program, but like the first step of I think it's like Alcoholics Anonymous or something, but the first step of like a lot of these programs is like recognize, be able to see yourself from the outside as an outsider. And so I've learned that this this imposter syndrome, I can kind of see it from the outside. And now when I start something new, a new team or a new job or a new whatever, I say, look, I'm going to go into this, the dumbest person in the room on this subject, and I'm going to know I'm the dumbest person in the room, and everyone else is going to know that, and that's okay. That's totally fine, because the company is not hiring you, or that person is not hiring you. If you're a freelance developer, for what you can do in the first 5 minutes. They're hiring you to do a task that's going to take months, maybe even years, and especially if you're doing things that require NSA clearance and these things. I mean, they have to have multiple year horizon when they evaluate somebody. And so I think that you're always going to have that imposter syndrome, but recognizing it for what it is helps tremendously.
Totally. I mean, I even think if for anyone who feels the imposter syndrome, which maybe we should define that real quick for anyone who doesn't familiar with this, the idea is people who feel like I'm not smart enough. I shouldn't be in this room. I shouldn't be in this job. There's other people smarter than me. That's called the imposter syndrome. And I think anyone who feels that way actually is probably one of the smarter people in the room, because you recognize there's more to learn. There's always someone who's more of the expert at something. And the fact that someone's more of an expert than you doesn't make you stupid. It makes you on the path to becoming an expert yourself, or it makes you smart to realize that let me get the expertise of this other person to help me solve this problem. And maybe I don't even ever want to become that expert. Like, I don't want to become an expert on how to fix plumbing in my house. I don't want to do it.
Right.
I am always going to have an expert plumber. I'm not going to watch YouTube videos to figure out how to replumb any part of my house. I'm going to hire somebody. And I think there's strength in that, and realizing like, okay, well, I'm going to choose my brain power to focus on something else, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, totally agree. Um, when a lot of people think about hacking, so we'll talk about hacking and then we'll talk about ethical hacking. When people think about hacking, I think there's two extremes. I think on one extreme, people think it's like, CSI, that meme where the person's like, I'm going to write a Visual Basic script to trace the hacker, done, and now we know everything about them. And then there's the other extreme, and where they feel like there really is no such thing as technical hacking. It's all just phishing and sort of social engineering, right? And so, kind of where are things? How has that spectrum kind of changed over time? And what really is hacking at the end of the day?
Hmm. That's the question that we should answer first, is what is hacking? Or another way we could ask it is, what is a hacker? And here's how we have to think about that, is that most people actually think that a hacker is is a malicious person, somehow associated with wrongdoing, evil doing, whatever. And that's actually not entirely true. A hacker is a problem solver. A hacker is somebody who sees the way a system works and says, can it behave differently than it was intended to? That's not good or bad. That's just a way of thinking. That's a predisposition, I guess. The fork in the road comes when we think about motivation. So, someone who wants to take a system and repurpose it or make it behave in ways that it wasn't intended to behave, and they want to do that to obtain some sort of personal benefit at someone else's expense. They want to harm an organization or some other malicious outcome. That's what would be an attacker, a malicious hacker. But the other side of the fork of the road is people who come from my corner of the world, which are ethical hackers. And those are people who still want to find those same flaws in the way the system works, but they want to do that so that they can advise on how to fix it. And both are professions. I mean, there is a very mature marketplace for malicious attackers out there, and there is a mature marketplace for ethical hackers. And so that's really what hacking is. And all the examples that you described, those all are hacking. Social engineering, where you try to trick somebody, or attacking via a technical method where you're actually manipulating a software system. Maybe the idea of trying to have some sort of like attribution or chain of custody of who is a person that did a thing, like that's a slightly different thing. That might not be hacking. That's more post incident. But these are all types of hacking, because essentially they're like, how do I take a system, make it behave differently? A person is a system. I can give you a social engineering example that is a system, right? Like, one time I wanted to get into a bar, and there was a long line and there was a cover charge to get into the bar, and I didn't want to do either of those. And so I recognized for what it was, right? It was a system. There was a system that says, you're a patron, you go through this line, at the end of the line, you pay a cover and you go into the bar. That's how the system worked. But I also noticed there's another feature to this system, which is if you're a VIP, you can go in the VIP line, there's no wait, and you don't pay cover. And so what did I do? I did what any hacker-minded person would do, and they said, well, how do I make the system behave differently? I'm not VIP, but how can I make it so the system thinks that I am? And so I went through a whole series of sort of leading questions and specially crafted inputs, the way that I said things to the VIP hostess to get her to reveal to me through the way I asked questions who was a group on the VIP list. And then I could just say, I'm with that group. And sure enough, that's exactly what I did. She was able to let me in the bar, didn't wait in line, didn't pay cover.
I have a similar story to that. That's amazing. I have a story where I was, I always fly coach pretty much. I mean, I've flown first class a few times because I had enough points. One time I flew business class for work, but I'm generally flying coach. There was a massive line at the check-in area. And this is before, I mean, now you would just check in on your phone. It's no big deal. But this was before that. And so there was no line for first class. And so my idea was that I would get in the first class line and I would upgrade to first class and just pay whatever it is, because it was worth it. Otherwise, I was going to miss my flight. And that extra value made first class worth it. And so I did that. I got the first class line. I upgraded. It cost me, I don't know, maybe $200 or something. And because of that, I didn't miss my flight. And a couple of people heard what was happening, because when I passed hundreds of people in the regular line, obviously that drew a lot of attention, and a couple of people were listening and they saw what I did and they got really upset. And I think maybe that's part of hacking is when you abuse a system, you instantly sort of draw the ire of everyone around you. But that was, I think, one of the few times I could think of my life where I kind of purposely kind of took advantage of a bit of a gray area. I wasn't first class yet, but I was about to be, and so that got me on the flight. And so those moments are a little bit magical. Like it is kind of a weird feeling, but when you kind of use a system in a different way, there's a certain feeling that you get. I can't really, you'd probably describe it way better than I do, but there's a certain feeling you get, like I managed to pull this off.
Absolutely. There's such an interesting element to this. I love that story, by the way. I would probably do that all the time. Like if you knew that, like, hey, just go in this line, pay a little bit more, and then your life is, yes, transfer money for time anywhere that you can. I'm all about that. But there's a really interesting element to the story that you just described, and it is the reaction of, I don't mean this in a diminutive way, but the reaction of the regular people. Because because we're talking about what's the definition of hacking. Well, there's people who, well, most people, when they see a system, they say, "How does the system work?" And I'm going to comply with the rules of the system. And then there are hackers, and hackers say, "How does the system work?" And I am going to either modify the system or abuse the system within the rules or change the rules. And the reaction that you saw was the inherently human feeling we have about fairness, of those people who are like, "Hey, I followed the rules and I didn't get the benefit." But most people are in that mode. Most people are, let's follow the rules. And that's why hackers, both of the good variety and the bad variety, are good at what they do and are necessary in, I mean, we're talking about social engineering right now, but in all aspects of building anything, because the average person doesn't look at things that way. Those people who got mad at you for doing what you did, why were they mad? Because they didn't get the benefit. But what did they not do? They did not look at that system and say, how do I make it behave differently? It's a special kind of mindset that's required to do that. And that's why people like us have a profession and, are able to actually, get hired by companies to help them solve problems like these. And it's a really, really, really important distinction.
Yeah, that makes sense. So would you say the majority of, let's say, breaches, for lack of a better word, are from social engineering nowadays, or what's that mixture like?
I wouldn't be able to answer that definitively. I'm sure there's endless statistics out there that could answer that question without a shadow of a doubt in their mind in any direction. Because
Got it.
the
Yeah.
truth is that at some point, we don't actually know everything about every attack. In fact, we probably know very little about most attacks. Um, but I do believe, not even believe, this is a fundamental truth, is that there is a human element to any attack. Now, I spend my energy, our entire organization, our company, we spend our energy really focused on how do we prevent software systems from being breached. Like that's really the main thrust, and then by extension, networks, computer networks and things like that. We don't focus as much on social engineering, but even I, as a person who focuses on software, recognize that the human is actually at the heart of all of these problems. So even if it's not that someone called up engineer Jane and said, "Hey, engineer Jane, I'm going to send you something. Will you click it?" Even if that's not what happened, engineer Jane might have built something, and let's not make it Jane's fault. Engineer Joe and Jane together, they built
Sure
this
enough.
thing, but they're humans and they didn't realize that an attacker might abuse functionality that they were building in a certain way.
Right.
And that is why that particular software system got breached. So anyone who's out there saying that, 85% of breaches are the result of social engineering, it's like, maybe. I mean, sure, there's data that might show that, but I don't know if that data set's complete.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, this is such a, or maybe just the circles I run, this is such a cliche, but other people out there might have not heard this. Patrick, I'm sure you've heard this. The World War II story about the planes that came back with bullet holes. So
Mm.
I'll just recap this for people who've never heard this story. In World War II, they're sending out planes. Some of the planes were getting shot down. Some of them were getting, I guess, wounded or damaged, and then come back. And then some of them were coming back, totally undamaged. And so they were looking at the damaged ones and saying, "Oh, they're getting shot a lot in this spot and that spot. Let's put some more armor so that they don't come back with a big hole in them in this spot." And it actually didn't help at all, or very little. It definitely didn't improve the kill rate, and the reason is because the ones that were downed were not coming back. So it's like if your plane is coming back, that's actually a good thing. And so maybe those spots are actually fine, and you want to reinforce all the spots that you don't have any bullet holes in. And so it's similar here where, it could be such that the breaches that occur from social engineering just end up being more public. And so you're just not seeing the distribution accurately. And so, to your point, it could really be anything. But I guess the high level bit we can take away from this is that they're both still used extensively. So there's still a lot of
Mhm.
social engineering. I actually just got a text message saying, "Hey, I need some information, blah blah blah," signed, and it's the CEO of my company. And my first reaction is like, "Who signs a text message?" And my
Right.
second reaction is like, "Why does the CEO, like they're like, why would he ever text me?" And then, sure enough, this got sent to like tons of people.
Mhm.
So that's definitely happening all the time. But to your point, the software side, I'm sure is happening just as often, or is happening in large numbers, and it's something that folks should definitely be aware of.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So, is hacking kind of like magic, where kind of once you tell someone the secret, it's not useful anymore? What are the parallels there?
Wow. First of all, I love the phrasing of that question. A lot of people do think it's like magic. They think we have this magic wand. We get contacted almost every day by someone who's like, "Oh, can you?" We So what I do is what we do. We help companies like who are building software, and there's like big projects. But I get contacted all the time by individuals who are like, "My ex hacked my phone and is looking at my email," and I'm like, what am I going to do with that? They're like, well, you have a magic wand, right? So people always think that ethical hackers, we have this magic wand. But so I love the way you phrase the question. And the nuance to your question is that once someone knows how a magic trick works, it loses, it's not as enchanting. Um, and that is, in fact, not the case with ethical hacking. It's not like, well, once we reveal the method, all of a sudden, somehow it's no longer effective. In fact, the methods have been long established for a very, very long time, and that was one of the things that when I was thinking about a lot when I was writing my book is if you're going to write a book that has to do with technology and it's going to take, I wrote my book actually very fast for writing a book. It was about 17 months from when I started it until it was published. That's like crazy fast. Most people take like 10 years to write a book or 5.
Yep, yep.
But even in my case, where it's like as fast as it can be, the question is, well, how will that be useful to people in 3, 5, 10, 20 years? Will it be useful? And when technology changes that fast, that's a valid question. And so for that reason, I really focused on, well, what are some of the things that are either timeless or are going to be highly resistant to change in time? And that's the principles of security. These principles that we have to think about today are pretty much the same principles as they were 10, 20, 30 years ago in tech. And you can even see these same principles in ancient books about war. Like, for example, Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War, and many of the principles in Art of War, many of the principles in Machiavelli's The Prince, these books are crazy old, and these principles apply to how we defend software systems today. You have to think about it differently, obviously, than like an emperor ruling a kingdom, and it's slightly different application of the ideas, but the ideas are the same. So when you read a book like the one that I wrote, which it's called Hackable, when you read a book like this and you see it lays out exactly like here's how an ethical hacker goes through the process. Here's what you're looking for. Here's why it matters. Here's why most companies are stumbling when they like skip this part. I point it all out, the whole thing. It's not going to change. It's not going to change the way the attackers attack. They're still going to attack. They're going to evolve and adapt. But now that it's completely open kimono, and I'm not the first person to have described the ideas, it's not like the magic trick where now it's like, oh, well, the magic trick doesn't work anymore. It still works because these principles are pretty timeless or at least time resistant.
That makes sense. I remember I somehow when I was taking systems engineering, um that gentleman, the professor, he also taught this cyber forensics course, which I didn't take that course, but it's interesting. He would tell stories about it. And the one story that really resonated with me was he said, so at some point, people were kind of challenging him and saying, well, I could do this and I could use this VPN and I can use, and I'm going to say a bunch of things I don't know a lot about. I could use like this onion router and I could use that. And at some point he kind of stopped and he said, here's the thing, you could do all of these things, but it's just another sort of dimension, right? It's like if you commit a crime, now you have to deal with making sure that there's no evidence in the physical world, and you have to deal with making sure there's no evidence in the digital world, and you have to be experts on both of those, and all the different dimensions that you can think of within those two universes. He's like, and so this is an area where someone might slip up. They might have really good way to some evil person might have really good way to cover their tracks, but not digitally. And so that kind of really resonated with me. It's like there's so many different vectors here, and so even if you might learn kind of like one magic trick, it doesn't mean you know every magic trick, right? It doesn't mean that you know every, and people are constantly coming up with new. There's that Penn and Teller show on I don't know on like where it's syndicated, but you can see it on YouTube where people kind of invent new tricks and share it with Penn and Teller. And so, to your point, what really stays constant is the philosophy and the principles. Um, but then beyond that, there's always more to learn, and there's always sort of this complex adaptive system that's being played out. And so just knowing if you were to become an expert on all the different um, you know like exploits, it doesn't mean that it doesn't put you, Ted, out of a job.
Right. Yep. Things will continue to evolve and adapt. And I mean, let's be honest. If if I could put myself out of a job, that would be a life's achievement. But I just don't think that it would ever be possible.
Yeah, it actually fascinates me, and it's something I just haven't ever taken the time to study, but just how things like trust, really worked, especially in the past. Yeah, my son is now getting older, and so I'm starting to show him the amazing glory of video games. And so I was showing him. I don't remember which game it was, but anyway, so I walked up to the king, and he gave me a quest, and I was showing this to my son, and it just kind of crossed my mind that like I'm carrying this sword and I could decapitate all these different things, and the king just lets me walk right up to him. And so it made me think, like, I wonder in the medieval world how that actually worked. Like, how did people with weapons get close to the king? And there's sort of a trust there, and how do you watch the watchman, and all of that. And so to your point, I mean, these are just timeless parts of human nature that will just never go away.
Yeah, the pandemic that we've all suffered through, I think, was has been and will and continues to be a really interesting exercise in the principle of trust. And if we take the politics out of it, which unfortunately is in this day and age is pretty hard to do now, but if we just look at like purely the idea of the scientific control of a pandemic, and you think about like why did we have masks and social distancing and minimizing gatherings and close businesses, and like why did we do all of these things? Because these were all exercises in defense in depth. Like defense in depth is a security principle that essentially says let's add layers of things to make it so that the bad outcome we want to make sure we avoid is less likely to happen. And so that's why you do masks and social distancing and washing hands and like all these things, um, because none of them, no single approach is wholly effective. And that's the same with building a system, the security mechanisms in a system. So kings, medieval times, wonderful metaphor. When we think about the king, actually, I talk about castles a lot as a security metaphor. And you look at something like the Tower of London, and that used to protect the crown jewels. It doesn't anymore, but that literally used to protect the crown jewels.
Yep.
And if you wanted to get to the crown jewels, you had to get across the moat with the alligators in it. You had to somehow like now scale the walls that had the guys pouring the hot oil down on you and the archers up on the turrets. And once you get over the wall, then you have to deal with the King's Guard, and you're now fighting them in hand-to-hand combat. And then you have to get through all these perimeter, concentric perimeter walls in the castle. And if you can eventually get through all that, then maybe you can get to the king. And then what? Now you have to get out. You have to like do the whole thing in reverse.
Yep,
That's
yep.
such a good metaphor for this really important principle, defense in depth. And so you were obviously talking about a video game. They simplified it for like, yeah, you could walk up to the king holding a sword because of video game. Absolutely not. An average person would not walk up to
Yeah.
the king with a sword in medieval times.
Right, yeah, unless they got in through all those circles of trust, right? So that sort of closes the whole loop on the social engineering part, right? Like somebody's next to the king with a sword,
Mhm.
and so there's the sort of physical layers, of getting to the crown jewels, but then there's also all of these social layers. And if you could, I mean, if this person was willing to spend the time and energy, and they had that evil in their heart, or whatever, like they could eventually get to the point where they're right next to the king with the sword. um and so that's a whole nother aspect of it. So someone said something interesting a while back about basically that the people who are sort of most really interested and obsessed and focused on something, um, that on average more of them are good people. Or I'm like mincing words here, but but yeah, it's an idea that like so many people who will go through all that training to be the king's right hand person, the king's protectorate or something, that at some point you just at some point the odds of that person being evil just become so incredibly low that
Mhm.
it passes some bar. And you say, okay, now this person gets to be right next to the king with the sword, or this person gets to be in the secret service to like make it more modern. And so that's the social engineering moat and alligators and boiling cauldron and all of that. And so I think building that trust over time is equally important.
Yeah, I think a great metaphor for how do you deal with that, right? It's not even a metaphor, it's just real life, is you look at something like the movie The Departed. I'm originally from the Boston area, so I'm like very partial to all things set in or about Boston, including gangster movies, like for whatever reason.
Nice.
Uh, but so this movie, I'm gonna maybe include some spoilers, but it's like 20 years old. So if you haven't seen it
You
yet,
could
I mean,
spoil it. Go for it.
yeah, that's kind of on you. But you've got, one of the main characters is an FBI agent, and he goes to go undercover to try to get close to the kingpin, this guy Whitey Bulger, and it really chronicles what it was like for that guy trying to do this, right? Because how do you earn the trust of a gangster? You have to do stuff that's directly opposed to your profession as a investigative police officer. Like literally, you have to
Right.
kill people, you have to rob people, you have to beat people up, and if you don't do those things, you fail the test and you'll probably die
Yep.
because the gangster's like, oh, this guy's not trustworthy according to gangster code. And then it talks about how it like, as you watch the movie, how it morphs this individual, and it's like, is he maybe starting to become bad himself now? And you don't necessarily know. And I guess it's supporting your point that it's like at some point we have to trust people, we have to trust systems, and so we have to have a criteria by which we assign trust. And it shouldn't we should assume hostility. We should assume everyone, like we should be like that gangster who's like, hey, I need to test everyone who's around me just so they can be around me. Otherwise, how do I know? And then eventually they go through enough tests that you can trust them or you cannot trust them. And that's, unfortunately, we do have to cross that barrier at some point, being able to trust. And this idea of trust is one of the big things that I actually argue about in my book, which is that security isn't actually just about securing something. It's about being able to earn trust, right? You need to be able to secure a system and you need to be able to prove it. And those are two different things. And one of the big failures that exists across industries, across geographic locations, across maturity of both individuals and security programs is that we oftentimes think that we can just tell somebody that something's secure. We think that we can prove it without actually securing it. And that doesn't work. That's like the person who's, I don't know, the Olympics are going on right now, right? It's like the person who's like, I'm the fastest speed skater, I should be on the team. And they're like, okay, well, go in this race. And if you win the race, you'll qualify for the team. And they're like, no, 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 no. I'm the fastest. Just trust me.
Yeah, right.
That's the way a lot of people talk about security. They'll say things all the time. Pick a website, right? They'll go to it and they'll be like, fast, reliable, and secure. And you're like, I can determine if it's fast. I can determine if it's reliable, but only someone with security expertise can determine if this is actually secure.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's really interesting. The analogy with the movie. I feel like because one could argue that it's hopeless, right? That you there's no way of guaranteeing. And I'll go back to the medieval times because I feel like talking about modern times is it makes me nervous. But there's nobody who can guarantee that the king's right hand person isn't going to kill him. Like, you can't guarantee. But to your point, like, maybe that king's right hand person has to do so many things, in service of the king, and get so intimate with the king and his family and the whole thing, that at that point, even if he came in with the intention of killing the king, he would have been like brainwashed with all of these experiences that would have eventually defined his life, and then he wouldn't do it. So I think, yeah, maybe you could make the claim that it is then possible to create, such a comprehensive set of hoops that even the most like untrustworthy or intended person goes through that trial and comes out the other end, trustworthy. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's two ways that you'd get that insider. I mean, this is what we're talking about right now, right? The insider threat. One would be, yeah, someone joins the organization with the express intent to earn trust in order to harm the organization. But in other ways, they could be recruited. And so, in the case of, yeah, someone who's close to a high-ranking, head of state or whatever, how do you kill a king? Maybe there's a weakness of that person who's in the guard, or maybe I don't know what their weakness is, but whatever the weakness is, and an enemy can take advantage of that. And
Makes sense.
whatever
Yeah.
the situation is, these are the things that this is why every organization, irrespective of time, we're talking about medieval times, let's talk about modern times, like everywhere in between, this is why we really need someone, or not even someone, like a team who is constantly thinking those more malicious thoughts, but for good. I mean, this is why my whole profession exists, is because most people don't think this way. It's a very uncomfortable way to see the world. It's like, I forget in the Matrix which pill it is that you take that all of a sudden you unplug from the Matrix, but it's like taking that pill.
Yeah, the red pill, you unplug; the blue pill, you stay in the matrix, I think.
Yeah, so it's like you take the red pill, you're unplugged, and now you're like, well, this is way worse than being in the Matrix was. Like, now I
Yeah.
see it's so uncomfortable. I see the ugliness of the world. But just like the main characters in that movie, we need people to see the ugliness in the world in order to improve the world. And like those of us who come from the ethical hacking world, it's like we see everything this way. Like, I told the story about the bar or whatever, but it's like literally every situation in my life, I look at it in that more malicious, like, well, how would you defeat this?
Mhm.
And that's not for everybody to think that way. That's probably not healthy, in fact, for everybody to think that way. But that's why we have to have someone, or someone's plural, thinking that way. Because going back to the medieval king metaphor, if someone's not analyzing like who's close to the king and what are the weaknesses that person might have, a bad apple might get close.
Yeah, totally. So when a company approaches you and says, Ted, we want you and ISE to help us out. Maybe let's say they haven't had a breach yet, because that's probably a totally different situation. But let's say they just want you to come in and help to secure their company. What do you do? Like, what is day one like? I mean, how does that go down?
Well, it depends on the scope of the project and what they're trying to do. But let's say, someone who's building a software system,
Hmm.
and their motivations may be several. They might themselves realize, hey, we know we need this to be secure, or we may realize we're building something that is gonna be very, very valuable to attackers, so we should get out ahead of this. But most likely the reason that they want to do this or they're being asked to do it is a customer of theirs is asking them to do it, or a regulator in an industry they are building the system for is saying, hey, you gotta like prove it in some way. And so usually what happens is that we get to the heart of what do they want to achieve, why do they want to achieve that. Usually what they're asking for winds up being a little bit different than what they actually need. Most people think of security as um, like a box to check or a cost to minimize. Like how do we do this the least expensive way that will satisfy my customer? That's the way a lot of people think about it. But
Ah,
the smart companies are the ones who say, well, if one customer is asking for this, I bet a bunch of my others are too. So why don't I not do the minimum? Why don't I capture the competitive advantage that this is and do it the right way and be able to differentiate from everyone else who's going to see, oh, what's the lowest bar that I can do right now? That's
it's kind
hugely
of like
differentiating.
yeah, the analogy is kind of like the robber in the neighborhood will try and rob the easiest target. Most people don't rob every house in the neighborhood or even half the houses. They're going to find like the one or two houses that they can rob, and so you just need to be better than them. Or I guess the other analogy is like if there's a lion chasing you, you just have to be the second slowest runner.
Well, here's maybe okay. I like the combination of homes and lions. Let's use a metaphor of homes in South Africa. Okay, so
Mhm.
home security in South Africa is significant because there's home robberies are like a really big problem there. And so really what we're talking about is the person who sells homes in South Africa. What they want to be able to do is say to their rich clientele, look at how good this security system is. Look, here's the cameras, the guards, the walls, the doors, whatever. Whereas most people are like, yeah, this is a secure house. That's a really,
Right.
really big difference. Someone who's like, I put some locks on the thing, versus someone who's like, let me walk you through the many ways we thought about security, built it into the design, and then executed on it, and then improved upon it throughout the build process. That's really the key. And so to your original question, like how do we get started? Once we define the goal, we help reshape what's the best way to achieve the goal. Then we define what the scope of the project is. Like, are we talking about, let's say it's a web app, are you talking about just the front end? Are you talking about the back end? Are you talking about both? Are you talking about any integrations with other third-party systems? Then we go about actually looking at items within scope and trying to determine, well, how would someone break this? And where there's areas that might be of concern, we'll dig a little bit deeper to actually determine, can you exploit it? And anywhere that the answer is yes, now we actually will build a proof of concept, like how would it work? Not build it, like actually go run and execute it, but we would show here in the code is where the issue lies. And then we tell them, here's how you fix it. They go and fix it. And then we come back and verify, did that fix actually work? So that they can now turn around and turn to their customers and say, not only did we do some security testing that you asked for, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, but look at how deep we went. Look at all the issues we found. Look how we resolved them. Here are the ones we didn't resolve yet, and here's why we're not going to resolve them. Like it's a much more powerful position to talk to your customer when you've actually done it right than when you're trying to be really hand wavy and smoke signals and hope they stop asking questions. Because if there's one thing that makes people ask more questions, it's when they feel like that the person they're asking questions of is being evasive.
Sponsor for today's show is Imparticle. At the end of the day, your customer has to be at the center of everything you do. This starts with the right customer data strategy, as well as the right foundation to solve the challenges that typically inhibit success, such as data quality, data governance, and connectivity. Imparticle is your real-time customer data infrastructure that helps accelerate your data strategy by cleansing, visualizing, and integrating your customer data from anywhere to anywhere. Ultimately, better data leads to better decisions, better customer experiences, and better outcomes. Some of the best brands in retail, financial services, hospitality, media, travel, gaming, and many other industries have chosen Imparticle. Learn more by visiting www.imparticle.com. Better data, better decisions, better outcomes. Visit imparticle.com to learn how teams at Postmates, NBC Universal, Spotify, and Airbnb use imparticle's customer data infrastructure to accelerate their customer data strategies.
I worked on, I built this thing called Eternal Terminal, which is like an SSH replacement. That's my one foray into doing like C++ and kind of low level Unix stuff. And an ethical hacker reached out to me with an exploit. It ended up not being that big a deal. Basically, it lets you masquerade as another user, but not root, maybe. Or no, even that is more than what it did. Anyways, it was not. Oh no, here's what it was. You could basically crash the equivalent of like the SSH server, and that would kick everyone else off. That's basically what it. So at any point in time, you could run this, and everyone would get kicked out of the server. They'd all have to log back in.
So effectively, like a denial of service in a sense, or at least make service painful.
Exactly, it's exactly denial of service. And the person, they're super professional about it. They actually reached out to me in an email. They didn't like make a issue on GitHub, which would have just told everybody. And they gave me like literally a Python script. And I didn't even know some of these things you could even do them in Python. Like they're pretty like low level networking stuff. But they actually gave me this Python script and I could run it. And sure enough, like it kicked me out of the terminal. And it's just clear as day. And I could, I put in a patch and then I ran with the patch and, the Python script didn't do anything. But it was beautiful. Like kind of the way it worked. It was repeatable. It wasn't like a suggestion or, oh, this happened when, or I was able to do this. To your point, like with the Olympic skater, it's like, here's a program and I can run this script and sure enough, it'll do this every single time. And that was really powerful to see.
Yeah, it sounds like you're describing what's called responsible disclosure, which is where a security researcher, an ethical hacker will perform research on an organization. When they find an issue, they'll then submit it to that afflicted organization in order to help them fix it. And then once it's fixed, then they can turn around and write a white paper about it or speak about it at a security conference like DEF CON or something like that. And that is the way that security research is supposed to be done, as opposed to just publishing the issue. But one of the problems that comes up a lot, it sounds like you were very engaged with this researcher who was trying to help you.
Yeah, he did tell me that after 60 days he would publish it, externally, which I was fixed long before then. But it kind of did encourage people to upgrade to the latest version when they did find it.
Yeah, you have to put the shot clock in there because otherwise you'd be surprised how many companies, despite receiving these known issues, won't do anything. And that hamstrings the researcher a little bit because, first of all, the issue is not getting fixed, which is the real problem. But then researchers are essentially compensated in one of two ways: financially or through recognition. And so financially would be where that's the business, right? So I've talked before about how like companies hire us. That's the business. Someone will pay us to do a project for them, but the condition is, of course, this is private to them. There is non-disclosures. We don't talk about this to anybody. Occasionally we'll talk about broad strokes of a story, but no one's identified, no technology is identified.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way you're compensated. Someone pays you to do it, but it's kept private. The other way is you don't get paid for it, but you can talk about it. And talking about it does a lot of things. It helps advance the state of the industry. It helps educate other researchers. It takes a researcher's profile and elevates that profile so that they can, maybe get a better job or start their own company or just be more prestigious or write a book or whatever they want to do. But the problem becomes when they're not getting paid and they're not allowed to talk about it. And so that's why responsible disclosure has to have a shot clock on it, because otherwise the companies could just not do anything. And that now both sides kind of lose because the company doesn't do anything. The researcher's like, when is appropriate for me to talk about this if the company doesn't know? Now at least the company's been notified.
Yeah.
And when they go talk about it, they won't disclose the actual attack script if the company hasn't fixed it, because that would just be irresponsible.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Totally makes sense. I think some things might be somewhat nebulous too. Like in this case, it was a pretty deterministic thing. You could just run it and boom. But in some cases, it might not work every time. Like it might be something that's in like based on some context that's difficult to reproduce, and so the company might not know they fixed it 100%. They might not know if they fixed 90% of the cases or 100%. And so they might have this, the companies are going to have a strong incentive for that reason, at least for that reason, not to disclose it. But as you said, that then you have this problem of we can't really tell who's out there doing great work in the security space. So I've heard a lot about DEF CON. I've had friends who go every year and they're super into it. Can you explain DEF CON? I've never been, so kind of like can you explain DEF CON to someone who hasn't been? And some of these stories, like I've heard stories at the hotels tell like anyone, whether you're there for DEF CON or not, to like put your phone in airplane mode because everyone gets hacked. Or like are these, how much of these are fantasy? How much of these are real?
There's a combination of the two. They are very real. That stuff happens at DEF CON. But I wouldn't say it's fantasy. It's not like you walk into the convention center and you're hacked immediately, but it is definitely the place you want to proceed with extreme caution in terms of your your technical life or your technology life.
Yeah.
But yeah, so DEF CON is it's a security research conference, so it's for researchers, and that's an important distinction because I think when most of us think about security conferences, we think about things like things that are more commercialized, like an RSA or something like that. Maybe if there's students listening, haven't been to conferences at all, maybe you aren't familiar with the idea of conferences, but um, where a commercialized conference is more about like the business of security. DEF CON is really all about the security research itself. It's where new research is published. It's extremely technical. So if you don't have interest in learning the technical side, like you might have difficult time there. But it's all about breaking things, and it truly is a community. I mean, like any community, there are people who are jerks and
Sure, of
arrogant and
course.
stuff like that. But for the most part, I find that the DEF CON community is people who are very supportive of each other. They're all there to learn. They feel comfortable amongst each other. I mean, it really does. Community is the right word, I think, for what is a very, very large conference. And yeah, hot new research gets dropped all the time. Like, here's the newest way to attack a solar array or a satellite or cars or stuff like that. We organize part of it. They have this concept at DEF CON. They call it the villages, and the villages are kind of like a conference within a conference where it's focused on a particular area. And we run one that's focused on Internet of Things and all the software that surrounds the Internet of Things. And yeah, it's just a cool place to learn and to meet people and hack stuff and meet other hackers, and it's a cool vibe.
Very cool. So I definitely want to dive into ISE and the company and how what positions you have available and all of that. But before we jump into that, what are some kind of tips, piece of advice you could give to people who don't want to get hacked? So this could be, professional, people who are developers, but it could also be just people out there who have a cell phone and they're worried about getting hacked, or they hear about their friends getting hacked. What is sort of some advice you would give to people like that?
So the question is advice for individuals as opposed to advice for companies or software development teams and things like that.
Right. So this would be, if it could be someone writing software on their side, let's say a college student or something like that. But this would be, yeah, sort of non-enterprise folks out there. What would be advice to them if they are worried a lot about this stuff?
Yeah, so a lot of the common advice that you'll hear around this question is things like, first of all, just be aware. Right, that's first and foremost. You want to be aware. So that means things like uh, being cautious of clicking links or downloading attachments that come your way. You mentioned at one point that you received a text message, and I assume it had like a link in it or something. It was some sort of request from a
Yeah, it had a
person of
link.
authority.
Yep.
Yeah, so like anytime something like that, just delete those things, or better yet, report if you are at a company that has any sort of IT or ideally security team, send that to them so they can hunt it down. But so many of these attacks originate from things like text messages or emails that have attachments or links. So, being aware of that kind of stuff, being aware of how authorization is typically given. So, for example, I still think it's pretty funny the way that doctors' offices operate right now. They call you and they're like, "Hey, is this Ted?" And I say, "Yeah." And they're like, "All right, well, we just need to verify that you are who you say you are. So can you give me your social security number?" And I'm like, "No, you verify yourself.
Yeah.
You just called me."
Yeah,
Uh,
right.
and so even though that is actually the way most doctors' offices operate, which is ridiculous, um, still push it back on them. They have to prove that they are in fact your doctor before you give them any information. So just being aware that we live in kind of a hostile world, and being aware of, yeah, attacks are coming, whether that's clicking links and downloading attachments are the biggest things, and forwarding that information to someone who can help with it. If you don't have someone to forward it to, at least just delete it and don't do anything with it. If it's something that matters, you'll find out about it. Like it won't it
Yep.
won't be the end of the world if you deleted a link that was like, "Oh, I was supposed to have that." Because that person will probably call you and be like, "Hey, I sent the thing. Did you? We got to sign this contract for this thing or whatever." You're trying to sign a mortgage. Like you'll figure it out.
Yeah, really good advice. Yeah, I mean, I know my wife and I constantly get calls from the quote unquote IRS, and they're like, you owe us a bunch of money, and they're totally fake. I mean, that's I think the IRS scam is now probably one of the most common. We looked it up once, and there's just website after website after website telling you all about the scam and how it works and everything. Um,
Two
but
other
yeah.
scams that, if we're talking about maybe college students or younger audience, there's two others to be aware of that are really, really effective. Um, and you can pick them out pretty easily, but they're still really effective. So one is similar to the IRS scam that says, "Hey, you owe back taxes," or whatever. It's about student loan debt. And so I fortunately don't have student loans anymore. I paid them off already. Um, so that's how I know these are scams, because they're like,
Yeah.
"Oh, your loans are in default," or whatever. And so every time I get them, I'm always looking at them and I'm like, how does this work? What psychological tools are they trying to use? I mean, I probably get one or two of those calls a day. And so that's a big one. Be aware of, like, if you're getting calls, especially if they seem really urgent and scary about your student loans, just go to whoever you have your loans with and call them directly and ask. Don't respond to
Yep.
someone who's contacted you. The second one that's really, really effective right now is these housing scams on Craigslist, especially if you live in a hot market. So if you're listening to a podcast like this and you're trying to get a job in tech, you're probably going to wind up in like San Francisco or New York or Los Angeles, Austin, these places that rent is really high. Places are gone before they even hit the market. And so it can be really tempting when you find a place on Craigslist and it's like, wow, that's in my budget. It's even a little nicer than my budget. Oh, wow, look at that. They replied to me. Oh, wow, they didn't need a background check. All I need to do is send my first month's deposit, security deposit, first month's rent, and this is mine. They'll mail me the keys.
Oh
Don't do that.
yeah.
Like,
Yeah, don't do that.
people
Yeah.
who rent you places, even if they'll send, and the scam's really effective because they'll send you what looks like a really legitimate contract, a lease contract.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, how am I going to get housing if I don't
It
take a
might
leap
even
and
be a
sign up for
place
something?
that's being rented, because you could just go on Zillow and find a place
Oh
for
yeah.
rent and say, "Yeah, this is me," right?
Totally, totally. Yeah, there'll always be a story like, "Oh, I can't show it to you because, I'm deployed overseas or I had to go take care of a sick family member, but don't worry, I have the keys. I'm going to mail them to you. Just go look at the place from the outside, but I can't let you in." You
Yep.
got to be able
Yep.
to see it. You got to know that this person can let you in. So those are two that I would definitely um, keep keep an eye out for, that are targeted specifically at a student demographic.
Cool. That makes a ton of sense. I saw one that was coming at it from a totally different angle, but it's still hacking based off the way we were talking about it earlier, where someone found a place that had included utilities. So utilities were free. We were included in the rent, and they proceeded to set up a Bitcoin mining farm and a laundromat. And so The owner got a $300 electrical bill and $250 water bill the first month.
Hmm.
Now, fortunately, they're in the contract. It says you can't run businesses. It's meant for living, and so I'm pretty sure that the owner is able to take care of that. But that's also an example of hacking where you kind of the included utilities was kind of not meant to include you like running your own laundromat.
Well, that's definitely an example, yeah, of someone who said, "Well, how can I, make the intended use of this system be different?" And so, yeah, they found that there was contract language, it sounds like, that prevented that, but I even applaud that person. They're like, "Whoa, utilities are included. Hold on a second,
Yeah.
let's go."
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty clever. So, cool. So let's jump into ISE. So ISE.io is the website.
Mhm.
And I guess it's a group of folks who assist other companies with security issues. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, so we're, a company of maybe about 50 people or so today and growing, and, yeah, essentially companies hire us when they're trying to understand what their security flaws might be in a given system and how can they improve them. And so, uh, basically we hack stuff all day. And it's
Nice.
rewarding, in fact, to see, when people find out about our company who, like, that's what they want to do with their free time on the weekend or whatever, and they're like, "This exists as a job?"
Yeah.
We're like, "Yeah, you got to do bad guy stuff and don't go to jail." So it's great.
Very cool. So, for folks who are super into this space and would love to kind of work with you, what sort of positions do you have? Do you do internships? Is it full time? Where are these positions located if they're not remote? And yeah, what are some of the details there?
Yeah, we have a lot of jobs that we're hiring for right now, ranging from security analysts to we have some, I believe we have some project manager type positions. We have some software developer positions that we're looking for, um, and there's probably some operational or administrative type jobs as well. Our We're headquartered in Baltimore. We actually came out of the PhD program at Johns Hopkins. Um, and our West Coast office is in San Diego. But we already had a pretty liberal remote work sort of situation before the pandemic, and then as we've been polling our people as pandemic seems to be winding down, who knows if it is or not, but um, I think the general consensus is everybody wants to have a hybrid work environment, and some people want to be fully remote. And so whether people want to be fully in the office, fully remote, or hybrid, we support all of that. um, Within the United States,
Hmm.
there's all kinds of visa issues with people outside the United States that we still haven't quite crossed that barrier yet. But within the United States, we're good with all of those. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of the culture is community. I mentioned that about DEF CON, but that's one of the defining words of what our culture is about. Is it's definitely a community. It's like the first word in our mission statement is to build a community. And so for that reason, I think a lot of people do like to come into the office. I personally much prefer it to being remote because I want to interact with people.
Yep.
But
Yep.
we're amenable to whatever situations people want.
Cool. That makes sense. And so, are there sort of internships or co-ops, or is it mostly full time at the moment?
Oh yeah, I knew that. I was like, there's one more aspect to your question I didn't answer. Yeah, our internship program is it's one of our best. I don't know if it's one of our best. There's so many great parts of the company, but our internship program is very robust. At any given time, we have one or a handful of interns. I mean, obviously, they kind of follow internship cycles, like typically summer.
Yep.
But what winds up happening with our interns pretty frequently is once they start an internship with us, they usually wind up like they don't go back to. I mean, they go back to school, but they stay work. Their
Right.
availability
Right.
shrinks, but they wind up doing, maybe a project during the semester, and then they'll ramp back up again for the winter, and then do a project in the spring, and then do summer. And so it's really great. So they get, our the people who come for our internships generally don't have any security background. Some of course do, but really it's just computer science is the big thing that we're looking for. Depending on the job. If there's other jobs that we don't need computer science background for,
Hmm.
but yes, we have internships, and also obviously full-time positions. There's a few part-time positions, and occasionally, once in a while, we'll hire a contractor, but it's primarily full-time and interns.
Very cool. Yeah, that makes sense. So, what is something that makes working at ISE unique? What is something like it could be the desk layout, it could be maybe you have a once a month you have a competition to see who can break into Ted's iPhone, I mean, what is something that makes working at ISE different than working somewhere else?
Yeah, you mean besides that we pay people to hack companies?
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well,
No, I
what's
mean
the
we're obviously,
unique thing about the culture?
yeah, we're not the only ones who do that. Um, so one of the things that I love about our culture is it's just fun shenanigans, and we kind of grapple with how do you communicate that to people outside the company, right? That this is a fun place to work. Like people like working with each other, and this is not your corporate toxic culture that people are like stepping on each other and backstab. It's not. It's like it's a community. I mean, that word is that is intentional, and some of the ways that that manifests is, I don't know. We do like a lot of the stuff that I think interesting tech companies do, like pay for a lot of meals, pay for a lot of like social events out, but we also have like awards to reward people for both the serious contributions they make as well as the goofy and silly contributions that they make. There's like one guy at the company right now who his ability to create memes about what our culture is, it's like, how do you, it's so spot on, and we're like always disseminating those to people. And we have a it's changed a little bit with offices being closed during the pandemic, but we have what we call the inter-office travel budget. So like each person has an amount of money every year earmarked, so that whether they're based in Baltimore or they're based in San Diego, they can go travel to visit the other office and like build relationships, but then also like, hey, if you want to make a trip around that, it's cool. Um, we have
Yeah,
unlimited
very cool.
vacations, so people can, like, one of my big things when we were building this culture is, I was earlier in my career, I before I went out and on my own, I worked for a company that their vacation policy allowed 2 weeks of vacation, and I told him when I signed the thing, I was like, just so you know, I'm going to take more than 2 weeks. Like, if you have to not pay me, like, so be it, but it's just not going to work for me. And I
Mhm.
remember distinctly having this feeling, that was my early 20s. All my friends are getting married. I was one of the few that lived in California. Everyone was sprinkled all over the country. And I remember being made to feel guilty when I had to fly on like a Wednesday so I could arrive in time for, the events on Thursday and Friday for the wedding on a Saturday. And I was like, when it's time for me to build my company, like, I will never allow anyone to feel that way. And
Yeah.
so our culture is just like, you got to live your life. Like, ISE and your life have to be integrated. You have to do work that matters. You have to be around people who are smart and make you better. And that's, I think, the culture that we've built, and that I think is very unusual.
Yeah, I had a similar situation where I joined a company and I was just finishing my PhD, so I still had a commitment to go to a conference, and so I had to go to the conference, after being at the company for like 2 weeks, and so I ended up having to go into like negative vacation. So I found out negative vacation was a thing. So I had like negative like 1.5 weeks of vacation, and it just it's kind of like seeing Mickey Mouse backstage. Like it's the person takes the mask off, and you realize it's just a person running around with a Mickey Mouse costume. It's like, sorry to spoil it for people out there, Disney fans, but sort of like when you have to go negative vacation, you realize that it's just like another system to be hacked. So and so it's like it's nice to just say, look, like we're all adults here. When you need to recharge and all of that.
Yeah, I think the bigger problem that we have is actually making sure that people will take vacation, take enough vacation, actually
Yeah.
take the time off. Like, I'm always berating within my reporting, berating is maybe the wrong word, but like within my reporting structure, I'm always telling people like, hey, you're taking next week off or 2 weeks or next 3 weeks, whatever it is. Like, I better not hear from you.
Yep.
You better not
Yep.
be checking on your email and responding to, Messenger and all that stuff. And I think now people are like starting to get it, because you have to really set that tone from the top.
Right. Right.
And most companies do the opposite from the top, right? The leadership is so engaged in what's happening that they're willing to work on their vacation. That signals to everybody else like, oh, vacation isn't really vacation. I'm supposed to be checking email even though I'm like, in Aruba with my girlfriend or whatever, boyfriend. Like, no, that you have to clearly communicate that, and I think we're doing a good job with it.
Very cool. Yeah, I found that as an engineer, I could code on vacation, but as a leader, I make absolutely terrible decisions. At first I thought maybe it's because I'm just frustrated that people are reaching out to me on vacation, but then I realized it was much more fundamental than that. When you're on vacation, you only get emergencies. And so your view, I've taken there's been a few times where I've taken like, 1, 2 month long vacations, because I'll kind of batch it up that way. And so I'll notice that, yeah, while I'm gone, it's just all I see are emergencies. And so and it's kind of a compressed timeline because you're not, working a full 40 hours or anything. And so it just feels like everything is on fire and you just get really upset. And I only in hindsight was I able to figure that out. And so, yeah, I totally want to echo what you're saying. When you're on vacation, yeah, definitely take your vacation, check out, put that person who's going to backfill you, let them take that role and run with it and shine and just be totally off the grid.
Totally. Yeah, I so strongly agree with that. And what we have to also realize, and I get that what I'm about to suggest probably feels like a leap for somebody who maybe is still like figuring out their career, or maybe they're earlier in their career or whatever, but is that you actually have to let the organization figure out how to do your job, or how to get the job done that you're there for without you.
Yep.
And that most people, when they hear that idea, they're like, well, then the company might realize they don't need me and they might fire me. So I have to show them that I'm important. And it's actually kind of the opposite. Like, you need to prepare your team. I mean, that's one of to be able to have an unlimited vacation policy like we have, it is a requirement that, people have to notify as much advance notice as they can, their team, their manager, it's everybody. They have to come up with a plan for like, okay, what's going to happen before I leave, while I'm gone, and then right afterwards. Who do I have to prepare? What information do I have to give them? And that's why a lot of people wind up um, checking in when they're on vacation, because they don't do that, right? They're like, oh, like no one can do this thing because I'm the only one who can do it, or I'm the only one who has access, and that's really, really bad planning. And what we have to do instead is we have to be able to equip the people around us to be able to survive for like a couple weeks without us. And that, no matter your level in an organization, from entry level to the CEO, that makes you a better team player. It makes you understand the processes better. It makes the systems run smoother because you understand them well enough to communicate them. You can find like, why do we do it that way? We don't need that. Let's get rid of that.
Yep.
And that can be scary for people to say like, I'm going to actively do something so that they can live without me. Like, what? But
Yep.
trust me, it makes everyone's lives so much better once you can do it.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, I mean, I mean, I think especially in leadership, like for you to build the next layer of leadership, you have to replace yourself. So in that case, it's crystal clear. But then, even as a tech leader or as a technologist, the same is still true. Like, for you to build the next system, someone has to take over the current system. And so it
Right.
holds true for there as well. Thank you, Ted, so much. This was awesome. I know some folks out there are saying, "Oh, like why didn't we go over SQL injection?" I mean, you can read all of that stuff on the internet. There is, and as Ted said, if we covered that a year from now, there'd be something totally different. And we get people who listen to our episodes from 2011 and still today. So what we said here, in my humble opinion, what we said here is timeless. It's always going to be true. It's facets of human nature, and we, Ted, you did a great job of kind of explaining, what security is, why it's important, and how it breaks down, and what you do when you join, an organization to help them out. And so, I really appreciate your time. Fascinating stuff. Definitely, check out Ted's book, #1 best-selling author on ethical hacking. So definitely check out the book. Do you want to kind of give us a rundown of what is your book, your site? Like, how can people read more about this? How can people catch you?
Yeah, the simplest thing to do would be to go to tedharrington.com. There you'll find anything you could possibly need based on what we covered today. So there's information about my book. It's called Hackable. You can find where to follow me on social media. You can contact me directly if you need advice on security testing. If you want to apply to work at our company, like anything you could need, just go to tedharrington.com.
Very cool. Thanks again for coming on the show. Super, super interesting. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Music by Eric Barndollar.
Programming Throwdown is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 2.0 license. You're free to share, copy, distribute, transmit the work, to remix, adapt the work, but you must provide attribution to Patrick and I, and share alike in kind.